You
Snow
did
rattled the
good.
cabin door when a
I
knock
know.
came weak as a whisper. Caleb Hart, a quiet rancher in the Wyoming territory,
I know.
opened it to find a woman near frozen, left behind by a wealthy cattleman who had called her unfit and tossed her aside. Caleb chose mercy. He gave her broth, firelight, and no questions. But pride rides fast in Dusty Creek, and that cattleman will return with papers, riders, and fury. Can one man's steady decency hold the line against wealth, gossip, and fire? Snow still clung in patches along the cottonwoods when the storm finally broke. Caleb Hart stepped out of his cabin, hat low against the glare, and breathed the sharp Wyoming air. The ridge was quiet, his 6 cows pressed near the fence, steam rising off their hides. Inside, fresh bread cooled on the table. Lydia March's doing. She had been with him only a week, but already the place felt less like a man's solitary camp and more like a home. She was a slim woman, with a steady gaze, not given to complaint. The storm that nearly killed her still lingered in the hollows of her face, but she baked bread with calm hands and hummed old hymns as she stitched the curtains she had found in Caleb's trunk. It was more life than the cabin had seen in years. That morning, as she swept the porch, riders came. Vernon Pike, the richest cattleman in Snowcap County, sat tall in his saddle, flanked by a hired hand and the town constable. His coat gleamed, silver trim catching the sun, but his eyes were hard as coal. "Merritt," he called, swinging down. The name rolled off his tongue like an order, though he knew Caleb's name well enough. "You've got something of mine." Caleb leaned against the post, arms folded. "Don't reckon I do." Pike pointed past him. Lydia had stepped to the doorway, broom still in hand. "That woman," Pike said, "she's my property. Brought her west by contract. You've no right to shelter her." Lydia's lips pressed tight, but she did not hide. Instead, she stepped onto the porch, dress mended, eyes calm. She held out a folded paper. "You signed this yourself, Mr. Pike. Dissolved your claim at the crossroads and left me there with no more than $1 in a bundle. You called me unfit for ranch life. I am not your property." The constable shifted uneasily. He took the paper, read the signature, and cleared his throat. "She speaks plain. This is legal. Pike, you've no further hold." Pike's jaw tightened. His hired hand spat into the dirt. "She's still a March." "Blood don't change. Blood doesn't bind without will," the constable replied, though his voice wavered under Pike's glare. "She may stay where she chooses." He handed the paper back to Lydia, tipping his hat. Lydia folded it neatly, her hands steady. "Then I choose here." Pike's face darkened. He tugged his gloves tight, spit fury into the dust. "You'll regret crossing me, Merritt." "I don't leave business unfinished." Caleb's voice was quiet, almost too quiet for the wind to carry. "This ain't business, Pike. This is a woman's life." For a moment, it looked as though Pike might strike, but pride turned him. He mounted again, dust billowing as his horse wheeled. "The thaw will bring more than grass. It will bring truth, and you'll find I finish what I start." The hired hand followed, the constable trailing, shoulders hunched with unease. When they were gone, the yard felt colder though the sun still burned. Lydia gripped the porch rail, her knuckles white. Caleb watched her a long moment, then said simply, "Bread smells good." She managed a small smile. "It's warm enough still." They went inside together, but the air held the weight of what had just passed. Caleb sliced the bread with deliberate care, set a piece on her plate, and ate in silence. That night, the cabin was quiet save for the crack of the fire. Caleb rose twice to check the fences, lantern in hand. At the far gate he found what he feared, a cut strand of wire drooping in the moonlight. Trouble had already come with the thaw. And though Caleb said nothing when he returned to the cabin, his jaw was set. He knew Pike's pride would not rest until tested. The wire Caleb found sagging in the moonlight wasn't an accident. By dawn, more damage showed itself. 3 steers missing from the north pasture, and a bundle of chickens lying dead by the gate. No coyote had left them so neat. This was human work, done to rattle him. Lydia stepped onto the porch, shawl tight around her shoulders. She saw the feathers scattered in the yard and the slump in Caleb's stance. Her voice held no panic, only steel. "Pike's hand," Caleb nodded, jaw set. "And Pike wants me to bite back fast, so he can call it lawless." She touched the rail, fingers white with cold. "So, we don't give him what he wants." Caleb saddled his bay and rode out, the cut staple in his pocket, the square-toed boot tracks fixed in his memory. He headed first to May Donnelly's place, a widowed neighbor with 2 boys and a sharp eye for movement across the valley. She served him coffee at her kitchen table, listening while he laid out what he'd seen. May shook her head. Men passed last night, quiet as foxes, headed toward Pike's north line. My boys saw the lantern glow. From there, Caleb made for old Ben Harker, the prospector who scraped ore out of the hills and knew every wagon that rattled through. Ben squinted at the staple Caleb showed him. That came off new wire. Saw a wagon hauling rolls of it by Pike's spread round midnight. Driver kept his head down. Caleb thanked him, his ledger already heavy with notes. He wasn't much for words, but he knew the value of evidence. By evening, he stopped in town. Reverend Abel Clay, tall and thin with kind eyes, found him on the church steps. Word travels, Caleb. Some say Pike means to starve you out. Others whisper he'll drag Lydia back no matter her will. Caleb's face was carved from stone. Whispers don't move me. Truth does. The Reverend placed a hand on his shoulder. Then gather it. Slow and steady. Truth walks with patience. Back at the cabin, Lydia had baked a fresh loaf. She laid it on the table, her hands dusted with flour. Caleb set the broken staple beside it. Got what we need to start. Wagon seen, wire bought, witnesses ready. Lydia sat across from him, her gaze steady. And the children in this town? They'll watch which way the wind blows. If Pike wins by swagger, they'll think mercy is weakness. If we hold by proof, maybe they'll learn strength wears a quieter face. Her words settled in him deeper than any sermon. He wrote more notes into the ledger, careful strokes of ink marking tracks, times, and names. He didn't just record for court, he recorded for memory, so no one could claim ignorance later. That night, the lantern glowed again on the porch. Caleb walked the fence line slow, listening to the hush of snowmelt dripping from the eaves. He thought of Pike's men laughing as they cut his wire, thought of Lydia facing gossip in town, thought of how thin the line was between mercy and surrender. He asked himself, not for the first time, how much can one quiet man hold against money, pride, and swagger? And here's where I'll ask you, if you stood in Caleb's boots, would you fight fire with fire, or would you gather proof and wait for the right moment? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe in quiet courage holding against the loud, share this story so more folks can see what decency looks like. The night pressed on, but the ledger on Caleb's table grew heavier, page by page. Trouble would return, louder than before, but so would truth, if he kept it steady. The ledger on Caleb Hart's table grew heavier each night, every line a quiet defense. But words alone would not stop Vernon Pike. If Pike meant to drag Lydia back under the weight of contracts and swagger, then Caleb needed law that spoke plain. He saddled his bay before sunrise and rode the frozen trail into Dusty Creek. The town clerk's office smelled of ink and lamp oil, stacks of papers leaning like weary soldiers against the walls. Mr. Greeley, the clerk, squinted as Caleb laid the folded letter on his desk. "Recognize that hand?" Caleb asked. Greeley adjusted his spectacles, lips pursing, as he read Pike's bold signature, dissolving the mail-order contract. Witness names scrawled at the bottom, a notary mark, faint but clear. "I do," Greeley said at last. "And I'll make a copy for the county book." Once signed and filed, no man can call it back. Caleb felt a weight ease from his chest. "That'll stand in court?" "It will," Greeley said. Then he added, lowering his voice, "There's more. Territorial code says once a promise is dissolved, by both word and conduct, no one can claim a person as property again. Pike not only signed this, he abandoned her at the crossroads. That speaks louder than any oath he makes." Now Caleb absorbed the words like water sinking into dry earth. "So, law's on her side," Greeley nodded. "If you keep proof neat, file every trespass too. Cut fences, stolen steers, don't just mend, record. A judge can't ignore black ink." By the time Caleb left, he had more than a copy of Lydia's letter. He had registered his brand and filed a trespass notice for the cut fence. His ledger was no longer just his. It was a book the county would have to hear. Back at the cabin, Lydia stood by the porch rail, practicing with Caleb's old pistol. Her hands trembled at first, but soon the tin cans he had set along the fence line rattled under her aim. Caleb leaned against the post, arms folded, watching with quiet approval. "You've got steady hands," he said. "Not steady enough yet," Lydia replied, reloading, "but steadier than fear." Caleb almost smiled. Fear had been his companion for years, though he had never admitted it aloud. Watching her face, pale from winter, eyes burning with resolve, he realized she had already claimed something stronger than fear. She had claimed choice. That Sunday, the town prepared for its church social, a gathering of hymns, pies, and gossip in equal measure. Reverend Abel Clay had promised Lydia a chance to speak if she wished. Caleb loaded the wagon with supplies, but his eyes kept straying to the ledger tucked safe under his coat. "Think words on paper will matter to them?" Lydia asked quietly as she smoothed her shawl. "They'll matter to the judge," Caleb said. "And if they matter to him, folks will have to listen." The wagon rattled toward Dusty Creek, wheels crunching frozen earth. Children ran beside the road, calling greetings. Some stared at Lydia, whispering behind mittened hands. She kept her chin high, her jaw firm. Caleb drove on, the rhythm of the team steady as his pulse. When they reached the churchyard, the square buzzed with talk. Pies lined the tables, fiddle music drifted in the crisp air, but the real weight hung heavier than hymns. Everyone knew Pike's men had been cutting fences, that trouble simmered just beneath the crust of neighborly smiles. Caleb stood at Lydia's side, as she held the folded letter against her chest. He could feel the tension in her shoulders, but her voice was calm. "I'll read it," she whispered, word for word. "Let them hear him condemn himself." Caleb touched the brim of his hat. "Then we'll see who listens. And you, if you were Lydia, standing in front of a crowd eager for gossip and ready to judge, would you have the courage to read a man's own words back to him? Tell me in the comments, and if you believe truth belongs in daylight, share this story onward." The bell rang, calling the town to gather. Lydia stepped forward, the letter in her hand, and the hush that followed carried more weight than any sermon. The church picnic in Dusty Creek was meant for hymns, stew, and pie, but that Sunday it carried heavier purpose. Caleb Hart felt it before his boots even touched the ground. Whispers curling like smoke, eyes darting toward Lydia March as she stepped down from the wagon. She carried the folded letter Pike had signed, her shawl, pulled close but her chin high. Reverend Abel Clay greeted them warmly, his voice carrying enough weight to hush gossipers near the gate. "Glad you came, Lydia. Folks need to hear truth in your own words." The meadow bustled with neighbors. Children chased each other between tables of beans and biscuits, while older men leaned on canes, their eyes fixed on Pike's corner of the yard. The cattleman stood there broad and smug, his foreman at his side. Pride radiated from him like heat from a black rock. As the hymn ended, Reverend Clay lifted his hand. "Before we bless the meal, one voice must be heard," he gestured to Lydia. The crowd shifted. Some frowned, others leaned forward. Lydia stepped onto the platform, her hands steady, though her breath caught once in her throat. She opened the letter, its creases worn, and read aloud Pike's very words. His dismissal, his signature dissolving the contract, his insult calling her unfit for ranch life. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Mothers pressed their lips tight, fathers exchanged looks. Lydia folded the paper and spoke, her voice clear. "He left me at the crossroads in a storm. I would have died if not for Caleb Hart's mercy. I am no man's property. I choose where I live, and I choose to stand here." A hush followed. Then Mrs. Donnelly, the widowed ranch matron, called out, "That's right. She speaks truth." The schoolteacher, Miss Carver, stepped forward too. "And she helps children already, brought books to our class. We need more like her, not fewer," Pike's foreman barked a laugh. "Words and pity don't change blood." But the constable, standing near, held up his hand. "Enough. She has legal paper, signed and witnessed. That holds." Caleb then showed the staple he'd kept, the sketch of square-toed tracks in his ledger, and old Ben Harker's note about a wagon near Pike's north line. "I don't shout loud," Caleb said, voice calm, "but I write down what's done. Fences don't cut themselves." The crowd buzzed louder. Pike's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist. "This is foolishness," he snapped. "I'll bring real law by week's end." "We'll see how long you stand then." Reverend Clay raised his voice, iron under the calm. "We'll see, Mr. Pike, but law doesn't favor pride, it favors truth." The gathering resumed, but the air stayed taut. Caleb and Lydia ate little, though neighbors slipped them smiles and quiet words of support. Pike left before the last hymn, his foreman muttering threats as they mounted up. On the wagon ride home, Lydia stared at the folded letter in her lap. "Do you think it mattered?" she asked softly. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. Some listened, some didn't, but the ground shifted today. and ground don't shift back easy. The lantern swayed on its hook as they climbed the ridge. For the first time, Caleb felt the town itself begin to weigh Pike's pride against plain decency. And you, if you'd been in that meadow, pie in hand, listening to Lydia speak against a man as powerful as Pike, would you have stood up beside her or stayed quiet in the crowd? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe voices like hers deserve to be heard, share this story forward. The wagon rattled into the yard, the fence line still mended tight, but Caleb knew trouble was riding fast. Pike would not let the matter rest. The thaw had only begun. By midweek, Pike's threats rode the air like thunderclouds, but Caleb Hart wasn't a man who bent quick to storm. He and Lydia had spoken little about what bound them, mercy, circumstance, maybe something more, but the time had come to put it plain. That morning, he walked with her down to the cottonwoods by the creek. The water was high from thaw, rushing fast. Neighbors gathered quietly, May Donnelly and her boys, old Ben Harker, Reverend Clay, even Ruth Wheeler with a loaf under her arm. They stood not for spectacle, but for witness. Caleb pulled a thin gold ring from his pocket, dulled with years, but polished clean. It was my mother's, he said. Not worth much in town, but it's worth something to me. If you'll take it, Lydia, I'll stand beside you. No swagger, just steady. Lydia's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. I'll take it. Not because I was cast off, but because I choose. Reverend Clay nodded and spoke vows simple as bread and water. Caleb promised to keep the lantern burning, no matter the storm. Lydia promised to stand her ground, hands steady, even when gossip cut sharp. They sealed it with a clasp of hands, neighbors humming blessed assurance under the cottonwoods. There was laughter too, pie shared, children running circles, May wiping her eyes. For a moment, Dusty Creek felt lighter, as though decency had won a round. But evening brought a darker hand. Smoke rose from the ridge as Caleb and Lydia drove their wagon back. By the time they reached the yard, the hayshed was aflame, fire licking high into the sky. "Water!" Caleb shouted, leaping down. Neighbors who had followed from the vows sprang into action, forming a bucket line from the well. Lydia grabbed a spade and ripped a trench through the dirt, her hands blistering, hair falling loose from its pins. Caleb fought the fire with a soaked blanket, choking on smoke. Sparks leapt to the cabin roof, but Lydia's trench caught the embers, keeping them from spreading. Her face was black with soot, her dress scorched, but she never let go of the spade. At last the flames died, leaving the shed a black skeleton. The cows bawled in the pasture, frightened but safe. Caleb stood, chest heaving, and looked around. Every neighbor's face was smeared with soot, but their eyes held a fierceness stronger than fire. May pressed Lydia's blistered hands into a damp cloth. "You saved the house," she said. Lydia managed a weary smile. "We saved it together." Hoofbeats cut the night air. Pike rode in with two men, their coats clean, their smirks wide. He reined up at the ashes and let out a mocking laugh. "Well now," he drawled. "Some wedding feast. Shed gone. Place near cinders. Looks like my warning was right. Hart can't manage a ranch, nor a woman." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Smoke curled around him, lantern glow catching the soot on his face. Lydia stepped to his side, blistered hands trembling, but her chin unbowed. Pike sneered. "Mark my words. This isn't over." He wheeled his horse and thundered back into the dark, his men trailing. Silence settled, broken only by the crackle of dying embers. Caleb put a hand on Lydia's shoulder. "We'll rebuild. He won't break us with fire." Her voice was hoarse but steady. "Then we build stronger." The lantern swayed on the porch, its light small against the blackened ruin, but it still burned. And you, if your home stood smoldering, laughter mocked by prideful men, would you give in to fury, or would you rebuild with steadiness and proof? Share your thought below. And if you believe fire cannot consume mercy, subscribe so you don't miss the next step of this Dusty Creek fight. Caleb turned toward the cabin, soot on his hands, but resolve in his bones. The shed was gone, yet the line they had drawn together stood unbroken. The storm was far from finished. The blackened ribs of the hayshed still smoldered when word spread through Dusty Creek. By morning, gossip carried faster than smoke. Some said Caleb Hart and Lydia March had brought Pike's wrath on themselves. Others whispered the fire was proof that a cabin wedding meant little in a county ruled by cattle wealth. Caleb patched what he could, moving charred beams aside, his silence heavy as stone. Lydia's blistered palms ached, yet she still carried buckets and mended what was left of the fence line. The lantern swayed at night, their only beacon against the whispers. 2 days later, Pike struck again, not with fire, but with words sharpened into blades. He rode into town early, gathered a crowd outside the mercantile, and mocked Caleb loud enough for every ear. Hart can't even keep the shed from burning. Mary's a cast-off woman, and now the county pays the price for his pity. You call that a man fit to run land? When Caleb and Lydia arrived for supplies, the crowd parted like water around them. Pike stood on the porch rail, coat gleaming, eyes cold. Fine pair you make, Pike sneered. 1 charity case and 1 charity keeper. Might as well hand the ridge to someone who can use it proper. Lydia's face paled, but her jaw locked. She clutched the supply list in her hand until it tore. Caleb, standing steady beside her, spoke low. Words don't build fence, Pike. That was enough to trigger Pike's shove, sudden and sharp. Caleb staggered back against the hitching post, but did not swing. The crowd gasped. Lydia reached for him, but before Caleb could find his balance, Deputy Marsh pushed through, eyes darting between Pike's wealth and the townsfolk's whispers. Caleb Hart, Marsh said, voice stiff. You're under arrest for disturbing the peace. The world tilted. You saw him shove me, Caleb answered, calm but edged with disbelief. Marsh's eyes slid to Pike, then back. Doesn't matter. You raised your voice, drew a crowd. Law says that's enough. Hands bound, Caleb was led through the street. Lydia cried out, "This is wrong!" But the crowd was already splitting, some looking down at their boots, others watching Pike smirk. The jail cell smelled of rust and dust. Caleb sat on the narrow cot, shoulders heavy. The ledger he had kept so faithfully lay back at the cabin. Without it, his notes, his proof, seemed far away. Night fell slow. Ruth Wheeler arrived, slipping past the deputy with a lantern and a satchel. She pressed a folded paper through the bars. Write it all down again, she urged. Every word. Patience and truth don't always win quick, but they win sure. Caleb opened the paper, blank pages. He picked up the pencil she'd tucked inside and began to copy from memory. Pike's signature dissolving the contract, the staple, the wagon sighting. The words steadied him. Each line a plank laid across rushing water. Hours later, Lydia's note arrived through Reverend Clay's hand. We're waiting. Lanterns lit. Her script trembled, but the meaning was strong. Caleb closed his eyes, picturing her standing in the doorway, the twins of smoke and rumor pressing against her, yet the lantern still burning. For the first time since the fire, his chest eased. Not from freedom, but from knowing someone was holding the line with him. And here's where I ask you, if you were the one locked in that cell, mocked by wealth, accused without cause, would you burn with anger or hold steady with patience? Tell me your thought in the comments. And if you believe quiet truth can outlast swagger, share this story so the lantern keeps burning. The night dragged on, the pencil scratching across the page. Caleb wrote not just for the judge, but for Lydia, for the ground itself, for the belief that a man's decency could still find daylight in Dusty Creek. The cell. Door creaked open at dawn. Deputy Marsh looked uneasy as he waved Caleb Hart out. Judge Holleran's come from the county seat. Tired of all the noise. Says he'll hold hearing right here. In the street, Caleb walked steady, wrists still bound, boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. Outside, Dusty Creek had gathered like it was a holiday. Men leaned on porch rails, women clutched shawls, children perched wide-eyed on barrels. Vernon Pike stood at the center, chin high, his foreman smirking beside him. Judge Holleran, a gray-bearded man with eyes sharp as flint, lifted a hand. Enough of the bickering. Bring your proof, Pike, and let's be done. Pike stepped forward, waving a folded sheet. Here's my writ, signed in Cheyenne. Says plain that Lydia March is bound to me by contract. Hart stole her. Harboring stolen property's a crime, murmurs rose. Caleb watched Holleran take the paper, hold it to the light, and frown at the smudged ink. This writ looks blotted, the judge said. Barely legible. She's mine, Pike barked. That's the truth of it. Holleran's gaze turned to Caleb. You have answer? Caleb's voice was calm, measured. I do. With your leave, sir, I'll show it step by step. The judge nodded. Caleb reached into his coat, drawing out the ledger Ruth had saved, and the copy Greeley had notarized. First, Pike's own words dissolving the contract, signed and witnessed, filed by the clerk, Gasps rippled. Halloran studied the copy, nodding slowly. Second, Caleb continued, my account of trespass, cut fences, stolen stock. Witnesses to a wagon near Pike's North Line, square-toed boot tracks, a staple from New Wire. He handed over Ben Harker's note, May Donnelly's statement, even Ruth Wheeler's sworn account. The crowd leaned in, the tide shifting. Pike's foreman scowled, shifting from foot to foot. Caleb paused, then lifted one last sheet from the ledger. His voice carried farther now. And third, this. Proof Pike tried to sell Lydia March in town, 2 days before the storm. I copied the bill myself. His own hired man offered it at the Mercantile. A shocked silence fell. Halloran's brows shot up. You're saying Pike sought profit, not guardianship? Caleb nodded. Yes, sir. He cast her aside when it suited him, then claimed her when pride smarted. That's not law. That's spite. The judge looked hard at Pike, who flushed red, fists clenched on his coat hem. Then Lydia stepped forward, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. Her voice rang clear. I am not property. I am a person who chooses. I choose not to belong to a man who would sell me like a mule. I choose to live where I was offered mercy, not chains. The crowd went still. Even the children on the barrels held their breath. Pike sputtered, Lies! All of it. But Halloran held up the blotted writ against the clean notarized copy. The law speaks plain. Pike, your claim is void, and this town will remember it. The murmurs rose again, stronger this time, leaning toward Caleb and Lydia. The constable, face red with shame, shifted his badge and avoided Caleb's eyes. Pike's voice cracked as he shouted, This ain't finished! But the weight of the crowd pressed silent against him, and for once his swagger faltered. Caleb stood, soot still staining his coat, but his shoulders squared. He had spoken plain, not loud, and the truth had held. And you, if you'd been in that crowd, would you have sided with swagger and wealth, or with the quiet proof of mercy and choice? Share your thought in the comments. And if you believe truth can stand even in the dust of lies, subscribe so this story keeps riding. The judge struck his gavel against the post. The sound echoed across the square, sharp as a shot. Pike flinched. Caleb did not. The tide had turned, but the storm had not yet blown itself out. The gavel's echo had barely faded when Dusty Creek exhaled, a sound like snow sliding off a roof. Judge Halloran's ruling carried weight. Pike's claim void, his writ declared. False. But in a county where pride walked taller than justice, it would take more than a gavel to change the air. Pike stood rigid, face scarlet, jaw quivering. His foreman shifted uneasily, eyes darting toward the crowd that had once cheered their wealth, but now leaned away. When Halloran ordered fines for false claim and menacing, Pike barked a laugh that sounded more like a choke. Fine me all you want, he spat. I own half this county. The judge's eyes, cold and steady, met his. And still the law owns you. The words hit harder than the fine. Pike wheeled his horse, cursing under his breath, and galloped out of town with his foreman trailing. For the first time, the crowd didn't follow. They stayed, watching Caleb and Lydia instead. Deputy Marsh approached, shame weighing his steps. Hart, he said quietly, I was wrong to cuff you. Letting Pike's word push mine was a mistake. Caleb studied him a long moment. Mistakes don't mend themselves. Takes steady work. Marsh nodded, hat in hand, knowing the truth of it. That evening, neighbors came up the ridge. May Donnelly's boys hauled lumber salvaged from her own shed. Ruth Wheeler carried flour and salt. Old Ben Harker brought nails and stories. Together they raised new beams, stronger than the ones that burned. Smoke from the fire still lingered, but the laughter of neighbors began to cut through it. Lydia worked among them, blistered hands wrapped but still steady. At dusk, she set a lantern on the porch and laid bread on the table for all. Her voice, hoarse but warm, carried as she thanked each one. You've shown what community means. Pike's pride may ride long, but your kindness rides farther. Children gathered around her as she pulled a small book from her satchel. Letters matter, she told them. Words written plain can outlast lies. She traced the alphabet with her finger in the dust, and little hands copied, crooked but eager. Soon the porch became a schoolhouse, lamplight spilling over their bent heads. Caleb watched from the fence line, hammer in hand. His land had been scarred, but in the healing he saw something deeper, mercy taking root, stronger than barbed wire. The ridge wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to anyone who chose decency over swagger. Days passed, and Pike's shadow thinned. Merchants once eager to credit him now asked cash up front. His hired hand, weary of blame, confessed to cutting fence under Pike's orders. The confession spread quick as wildfire, burning away what remained of Pike's bluster. One evening, Reverend Clay stopped by. He leaned on his cane, gaze sweeping the rebuilt shed, the children laughing over chalk letters. "Strange thing," he said softly. "Sometimes a man's fall opens a door for everyone else to stand taller." Caleb nodded. "Sheds can be burned. Truth can't." Inside, Lydia hummed as she stitched, the same tune she had sung the day Caleb first opened his door. The quilt she'd been piecing, patches from scorched cloth, mended with brighter scraps, hung near the cradle. Its star center glowed against the lamplight. The house was no grand ranch, but it breathed with warmth stronger than Pike's silver trim had ever carried. And you, if you had watched neighbors raise beams on blackened ground, would you have lent your hands or just your eyes? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe healing starts with small mercies, subscribe so this story can ride farther than Dusty Creek. That night, as Caleb banked the fire and Lydia checked the lantern, the ridge felt quiet, not empty, but settled. Trouble had not vanished, but for the first time, peace felt possible. The light in the window burned steady, a promise of what was still to come. Winter thinned, and with it, Pike's shadow. Snowmelt filled the creek, calves fattened on greening pastures, and Lydia's porch lessons grew into something more than pastime. By spring, half a dozen children came each evening, tracing letters in chalk while their parents traded news by the song. Fence Caleb added benches to the porch and carved a shelf for books. A cabin that once knew only silence now hummed with voices. The ridge was healing, though scars remained. The new hay shed stood sturdier than the last, beams squared by neighbors' hands. The quilt Lydia pieced, stitched from scraps of charred cloth, hung proudly by the cradle, proof that even ruin could be remade into something lasting. Then, one late afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge. Gray-haired, shoulders hunched, Pike looked smaller than the storm he had once been. Behind him rattled a wagon carrying crates. He dismounted stiffly, hat in hand, pride worn down to threads. "I came to settle," Pike said, voice rasping. "Law's beaten me. Folks won't trade on credit anymore. I can't undo what I've done. But I can leave something." He pried open a crate. Inside lay books, readers, primers, Bibles, spellers, stacked neat. "For her school," he muttered, eyes on the ground. The children, wide-eyed, crowded close. Lydia touched the books, her face unreadable. "Thank you," she said at last. Then her voice steadied. "But these are for them, not your name carved in the cover. They need pages, not monuments." Pike nodded once, almost in relief. He left the wagon and rode off, a small figure shrinking against the sky. Caleb watched him go, a man cracked like dry clay but no longer dangerous. Pride had broken where law and mercy had held. That evening, lanterns glowed on the porch as children leafed through the books. Lydia read aloud, her voice sure. Caleb sat nearby, mending tack, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. The twins she once feared to lose now giggled at her knee, their small hands tracing letters with the rest. Reverend Clay stopped by, smiling at the sight. "Strange thing, Caleb. Sometimes a storm leaves behind what sun alone never could." Caleb nodded slowly. "Storm near burned us out, but it also showed who'd stand with us." The Reverend's eyes softened. "And that, son, is the real wealth of a place." Later, as the crowd thinned and the ridge quieted again, Caleb and Lydia sat by the fire. No ceremony, no grand vows, just two people who had weathered fire, gossip, and swagger, and found themselves stronger for it. Lydia placed her hand over his. "We'll raise more than cattle here," she said. "We'll raise voices." Caleb squeezed her hand, the lantern light catching the gold ring he had given her. "And we'll keep the door open, no matter the storm." Outside, the night stretched wide, the ridge breathing steady. The lantern swayed on its hook, its glow spilling across the yard, no longer just a warning, but a promise. And here's where I ask you, if second chances rode up to your gate, weary and broken, would you turn them away or let them in? Share your answer in the comments. And if you believe mercy and steady decency still matter in this world, subscribe so more folks can ride with us through stories like this. The ridge slept under a sky of stars, the cabin warm, with laughter and lamplight. Dusty Creek would remember the storm, but it would also remember the mercy that held through it. What began as a knock on a winter door had become something greater, a covenant of care, spoken not in boastful words, but in bread shared, fences mended, and a lantern that never went dark.